Okay, next up, we have Kerberos. Now, Kerberos is actually, in Greek mythology, a three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades, and it's applicable here because there's really three components when a user or a client wants to access some type of service. Okay, so it's a network authentication service that was originally developed by MIT, and it's used for mutual authentication between client and server. So this gives us that dual authentication I talked about before, where the client authenticates to the server also authenticates to the client. All right, so some key terminology before we get into the details here. So we have something referred to as a KDC, or a key distribution center. We have an authentication service, or the AS. We have a ticket granting ticket. We have a ticket granting service, a principal, and an authenticator. So, and here's kind of the layout of the example that we're going to be using. Okay, so if we look at this in a little more detail, I'm just going to cover this at more or less a high level. Okay, you don't need to really dig down into the nitty-gritty details for the exam, but just for your own information, there's a couple things that go on here in the background. Okay, the client wants to connect to a service. The client needs to authenticate, right? So we're using KDC, or a key distribution center, which in a Windows environment is going to be the domain controller. That's going to contain the authentication service and also the ticket granting service to give those TGTs, right? So the client will send that request to the KDC, or the authentication service. The authentication service will generate what's called a session key. So it's going to encrypt that session key with the user's password, and it encrypts the session key and this user's username, which is also referred to as a Kerberos principal. So it's going to create what's called a service ticket, send that back to the client. There's two pieces to that. The client can decrypt the first part because obviously it has its password. The password, incidentally, is not ever sent over the wire. It's a hash on the client side, and it's a hash on the domain controller. So that is used to encrypt, and then it's sent back. The client can decrypt that first part, cannot decrypt the second part because it doesn't have that, only the service does. But the client will encrypt that second piece along with a timestamp, which is referred to as an authenticator, and it sends that service ticket over to the service, or the server that it needs to connect to, right? The server can then decrypt because, again, it has that information that only it can decrypt. So that's where these mutual authentication is going back and forth. Only the client can do what it can do because it's the only one with the password. Only that server can do what it can do because it's the only one with the password. So if anyone were to capture that in between, it's not going to do much good because, again, we have things timestamped as well. So that prevents replay attacks and things along those lines. Once all this is done and the service looks up and says, okay, I trust the KDC, the client trusts the KDC says, yes, the client's valid, go ahead and grant that service, they connect. Now going forward, each time that needs to happen again, rather than having to go through this process for every single connection, you get what's called a ticket granting ticket. So that kind of takes that first part out of the loop. So the next time it needs to make a connection, the client goes to the KDC, to the authentication service, requests that TGT, send that over to the service. And that's encrypted by the session key that was originally set up with that AS, okay? It only has an 8-hour lifespan, so every so often that's going to need to be regenerated. But the point of that is, the very first time it needs to connect to a service, it's going to go through the process, encrypt, get those two pieces sent to it. It's going to be able to decrypt one. It'll re-encrypt the second piece along with a timestamp, send it over to the service can decrypt. Next time around, it uses a ticket granting ticket to shortcut that process so it doesn't have to re-authenticate. It's already valid with a session key that's valid again for 8 to 10 hours. So that way it can just pass directly over to the service and make a connection.